Good evening, everyone. I'm Sue Hodgen. I'm the chair of Southport's Planning Board, and I'm calling us to order at 6:02. We ask that everyone, if you will, please silence or put your phones on vibrate. We love ringtones, but not during the meeting. If we can, let's start by removing any hats, and those who can or will, please stand while we have our invocation. Oh, Donnie's not here yet. And then we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. Is he coming in the door? Hold on, Lord. We'll be right back. I will note that we have one member by phone with us tonight, Scott Jones, and I was getting ready to say Chris was going to be a couple minutes late, but he got in the door as well. So thank you for that, and good evening, Scott, if you can hear us. Next item on our agenda is the approval of the minutes. Members were issued the minutes of our April 20th meeting in advance. Are there any changes or corrections? None. Can I have a motion, please, to approve those minutes as prepared?
So moved.
Thank you, Will. And a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dick. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. The next item is approval of this evening's agenda. You were also issued this in advance of the meeting. Are there any additions or corrections? Motion to approve, please.
So moved.
Thank you, Will. And a second? Thank you, Donnie. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Moving to public comment. Do I hear a motion, please, that we move into our public comment period?
So moved.
Donnie, and a second by Will. Thank you. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That also passes unanimously. I'll ask our deputy city clerk to call the names of those who signed up to speak.
Rich Bandera.
Hello, I'm Rich Bandera. I live at 409 North Burrington Ave here in town. I'm here to speak against the conditional zoning expansion into residential districts. As you know, I've been here at all these meetings. A newer kind of item that came up as part of the Alderman meeting, and I brought it up a little bit. I didn't know it was going to actually be presented as part of the budget, was a comprehensive plan, and it was at the top priority from the city manager in terms of what the city should take take care of as far as looking at the land planning. And it was, you know, in terms of budget items, it was the third, I think, most costly item at $100,000, which we'll all be paying for. And saying that, in the if that moves ahead, I'm not sure if the alderman voted to approve it or not, but as part of that, that would be a planning study to address all the new infrastructure that might be coming to town and revisiting the future land use plan. And so a process like that, and so we've been talking about conditional zoning, or you've been talking about it for 6 months, close to it anyway. And the comprehensive plan, if it initiates a future land use mapping, and that's a big public process where we could all be part of it and have our 2 cents considered, would be about 18 months. So it will go by like a flash. So if a traditional rezoning process can be done through the comprehensive plan, and it looks like it's gonna move ahead, why talk about conditional zoning and flexibility when you're gonna have that through that process? And so that's a new point of it. It doesn't change what I've always said about the residential expansion. I would ask that you table the conditional zoning expansion and see what the aldermen do about the comprehensive plan and, you know, enacting that and looking at the remapping and that process and including the public in that more extensive and a longer process. But I think that will go by pretty quickly. Thank you.
Next, no one else? Is there anyone here that didn't sign up that would like to speak in public comment? All right, we thank everyone, as always, for their interest and attendance in our city's processes and actions. Do I hear a motion that we end public comment? So moved. And a second? Second. Thank you, Dick. There is a motion on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes unanimously. We'll move into old business. We have 2 items of old business, and I'll ask our Development Services Director, Travis Henley, to present staff reports and notes on those.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, good evening. I'm covering for City Planner Mo Meehan tonight on the first item. She's unfortunately not feeling well. I also feel like it's the least I could do since she had the hard items in front of the alderman last week. But the first case on the agenda is a text amendment to Section 319 of the Unified Development Ordinance, specifically regarding signage. This zoning text amendment is applicant initiated, and the applicant is here tonight and concerns halo and backlit illumination. You also hear it referred to in other places as silhouette illumination as well. A couple pictures of different examples of what this type of lighting can look like in various places. This was presented to the board at your April 20th meeting and was tabled for further study by the members of the board. In the staff report, as was the case in the presentation on April 20th, there are 2 options that staff and the applicant have identified that would both seemingly accomplish the same thing. One is just to amend the existing ordinance, which currently states, illuminated signs shall be limited to those lighted internally with glass or plastic faces bearing the advertisements and diffusing the direct rays of light of the light source to prevent any direct line of sight with said light source. So one option is just to change that and to an or and leave the rest of the language as written. The other option, which speaks more directly to this specific thing, is just to explicitly call out backlit and halo lighting that otherwise meets the provisions of Section 319, which is the rest of the signage ordinance, would be allowed or permitted. As I mentioned, the planning board tabled the item for further study. The next steps would be to consider the amendment for a recommendation and then Once that recommendation is reached and voted upon, this will be presented to the Board of Aldermen in accordance with the typical zoning text amendment process. The applicant is here and I believe would like to address the board. Yes, so, but I can certainly answer any questions you may have as well.
Let's go ahead and let Ms. Hammond speak if she'd like to, and then Travis will see what questions there might be. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bev Hammond, live on West Owens, and yes, is this on? Oh, sorry. And David and I own Haven, and the way this came about is that we were given a permit for a sign that we had we put a lot of thought and intention into what we were building with the Haven, and we wanted it to fit really well into the town, not to be bright, flashy, touristy, anything that's going to raise a ruckus. And we did had the same thoughtful approach with our sign. And we purposely wanted something that was very soft, subtle glow, nothing bright or just circusy, I guess. Certainly nothing as bright as probably half of the signs along the business section of town. And we received the permit, and then about 2-3 weeks later, as it's being fabricated, the permit, Maureen called Mark from Power Signs, who was fabricating the sign, and had a conversation with him to say another permit had been requested, and it made them relook at our permit, and there's some problem with the language in the UDO, which is the and/or issue. And that's the point at which Mark and Mo and David and I had conversations saying that really what needs to be done is, because there's been such an evolution in lighting and capabilities and the kelvins and the lumens and everything, that the UDO is outdated in a sense. And so Maureen gave us the options of what to do. And that's how it came to be that we put in for a text amendment. I think we kind of take issue with, at the last meeting where it was, the planning board indicated that they did not want to change anything in the UDO for the benefit of one resident. We're not doing this as one resident. We're doing this because when we see anything in town that we think will benefit the town overall, and in this case I think it will, it's not about us and whether we get what we want or we don't. It's about making a UDO that is functional and usable and thoughtful and works for everybody. And we feel that the intent of the UDO is that, but that in practice, that entire section probably needs to be looked at and reviewed, and maybe other areas tweaked. So Mo's recommendation was that we make this part of a bigger project that really doesn't involve us per se, but that whole section of the UDO be looked at, and perhaps bring someone like Power Signs or bring some lighting expert into the conversation to say, here's where the technology is, and here's what you might want to consider putting into this ordinance so that it's thoughtful and logical for all, and we don't run into this type of situation for a while. But we all know that the UDO is a living, breathing document, and it needs to constantly be updated in many, many areas. You can't just leave it stagnant because everything changes. So we're hoping that new language can be written and bring it up to date so that some of the current lighting technology, for instance, what we recommended, or what was recommended to us, meets every criteria in the sign ordinance, with the exception of that statement that requires that it meet 2 conflicting criteria. And if it was or instead of and, you only have to meet one of them, which we do. And we totally understand that when this was written, that halo lighting, I think, was bright. It wasn't controllable. It wasn't LED. It wasn't warm, soft white light. It was a very specific type of lighting, and it was new. That has evolved, and for anybody who's driven by and seen our sign, there's nothing bright about it. It's a very, very, very soft glow, and it's very subtle. It's not even as bright as those pictures that you saw were samples that I sent to Mo as an example of other businesses, not here in Southport, but other businesses that have used it. And ours is far and away much more subtle and than those. So for that reason, we're not looking for this to be a decision where you say, okay, you know, we're going to make this change for us. The change is about keeping the UDO relevant. And in that respect, I personally think that it would be a good idea to recommend that the entire section of the UDO be reviewed for relevancy and maybe go beyond just the and the or discussion at this point. I don't know, honestly, what that entails. I don't know how big a project that is. I don't know, I don't even profess to know what goes into that. But I do want to make it really clear that this isn't about us. It's about creating an ordinance that will benefit the city in the sense that the next person who comes along with a permit, requesting a permit like this, there'll be some more updated lighting documentation to help guide the decision of whether it's a good idea or not something that you can permit. So we're happy to answer any questions or to give you any information that you might want. The person we've been working with, Mark at Power Signs, has been doing lighting for 30 years. He said this is the first time he has ever run into this situation, and actually that some of the lighting requirements in our UDO are, you know, twice as restrictive as a lot of other municipalities already, which not a good thing or a bad thing, but he's very, very astute and well-versed in it, and he or someone like him would be a really good resource to bring into this discussion to help make a really educated and smart decision about how to proceed with it. And in the interim, we do have a provisional okay to use the light because it was okayed. We're hoping that that you will see fit to restructure some of the UDO so that us and others like us will be able to have some creativity with our signs, and they won't be bright, they won't be, I mean, there's a lot of signs in town that I'm sure you are aware of, and lights that are blinding that are okay. But just because we fall into the category of halo, we were, you know, summarily told, made a mistake, can't have the permit, or we were going to discontinue the permit. So I don't know if you have any questions or need more info from us, but that's kind of how it rolled out. And again, we're here to help create something for the city that will be beneficial, not to say this is what we want, this is what we want for us. It's for the greater good, in a sense, because it will help the city going forward.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Hammond? Thank you, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any questions for Travis on this item? I'd like to ask that we have another tabling of this item, since we are continuing to assess the lighting and the signage for the business district and discussing the merits with staff of associated and additional changes for both of those areas. We're not under any requirement to complete this item tonight. We have 90 days from the date the board first received it, which was April 20th. And as Ms. Hammond indicated, they do have a special letter of agreement with the city manager to operate their signage as they ordered, so we're not disrupting their business or inconveniencing them in this matter. Can I get a motion to continue the tabling of this item for additional consideration and future work? Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Will. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion?
Madam Chair, ma'am?
Yes.
Just if there is any feedback on this item in advance of the next planning board meeting, staff would appreciate knowing what that feedback was.
As we're all looking at signage and lighting around town like we talked about doing last time, that absolutely, we want that sent straight to Travis for that, so they can see that.
And I would like also to put on record that I very much appreciate what Ms. Hammond had said about studying the entire thing, and I agree. However, with regard to the 90-day restriction for text amendments, If we get to that point, we're not done with the rest of the ordinance, it would certainly be appropriate to make a motion on their specific request and send that on while we continue the work for the rest of it as well.
Agreed. All right, so motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Our next item then, Travis, if you'll continue on with the conditional zoning text amendment, please.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, members of the board. Conditional zoning. It's our favorite process slide. So here we are, 518, follow-up from the special meeting that was held on May 3rd. We have made a couple of changes. The first change we talked about previously, this is the essentially as the ordinance was, or as the draft was first written, the 20% open space requirement that was already existed within the PUD process was lifted straight from that process and added to conditional rezonings. Following feedback from the board, we essentially added additional thresholds. So as residential projects got bigger from a unit size perspective, the amount of open space they were required to preserve also increased. And so for every 250 units, your required open space reservation requirement increased by 5%. The way that math ended up working out, ended up at a maximum of, when a project exceeded 1,500 units in size, 50% of the tract would be required to be preserved as open space. And that is open space in accordance with the PUD standards. So that's not inclusive of wetlands and other items. These are good upland areas. There was also a fair bit of discussion at the special meeting about maximum height. And so what staff have done is essentially, there were a number of options here. This one is probably the simplest, which is just to say that if you're requesting a conditional rezoning, the maximum height that you can ask for is the same as the maximum height in the zoning district you're starting with. So if you're starting with a conditional rezoning from the CBD or the BD district, your max height is 30 feet. If you're starting from the residential districts, it's 40 feet. If you're starting from the industrial districts, it's 50 feet. There's a star there. And there's a star there because, as the board knows, because you've just done a text amendment like this, the maximum height for the zoning districts can change via the text amendment process. And so if a change like that is made in the future, regardless of what it is, that would have impacts here because this section references the dimensional table in section 3.9 of the UDO. There's also been more explicit references, one, to the fact that the only individuals who can ask for a conditional rezoning are the owners of the property included in the conditional rezoning request. Additionally, there's a specific reference to the non-contiguous acreage and the right and authority of the board to review that non-contiguous acreage in the context of the entire project to make sure that it actually has a justifiable purpose to be part of the project. In my opinion, in my reading of statute, you had the authority to do that anyway. However, included in the ordinance to make sure. That is the extent of the changes that have been made to the specific language since the last meeting. I want to stop there and see if there are any questions before moving on.
believe you can hear me. I believe you can hear me a block from here with this, but I'm the newbie. I'm brought into this long study, good study, and I've been playing catch up, trying to understand. And I would like to, if you don't mind, go through some comments and concerns I have about this. So if you can just bear with me as I speak more than a few sentences, I would like to. Number one, what Mr. Bandera said tonight, thank you. I had no idea about that, and that is an interesting thought that we've got restudy coming in front of us. Two, I truly believe an updated conditional zoning is needed, is required, and this board has done a great job to put this together. I believe it does need to include residential, okay? I believe it's a good thing to have more reviews and better plans to review. I think the TRC needs to have some teeth brought into that review committee, and it needs to be forced to give technical reviews of any project that comes to a board before it comes to a board. It's just we're novices. We've got a good staff, and I think that TRC needs to be an absolute part of anything going forward. All right. Why? We're doing this because we are trying to protect the character of Southport. And we're trying to encourage developers to utilize an updated document. Okay, and like I said, more input, technical review committee, better plans, more reviews, more public input is all good. I have some concerns though, and I want to just lay them out as simply as I can. The first one, and again, I am walking into the backside of this, but when we get to the open space requirements, I believe that if it's submitted like this, it'll discourage most any developer from wanting to use this document. Because when you get up to 50% of a piece of land, not including wetlands, that you can't build on, if you wanted 4 units an acre, you're going to end up with like 10 to 12 units an acre by the time you get roads in and all. And I don't think that's what any of us want in this town. We need somehow to encourage, number one, market demand, but also the character of this town. And I really am concerned after looking at this, and I can give you an example if you want it, but I just know that this will be a dead end for a lot of people who would want to use this with more than 5 acres, okay? And like I say, I'll be happy to give an example on that. The amount of required information on the initial and later reviews and plans, again, we've got to make sure that we encourage someone who owns land or who wants to develop a piece of land to use this document. And I don't know the answer here, but I do understand enough that developing a plan early on to this detail, which is what is needed in some ways, but is also going to let some developers just say, I'd rather just go another way and get through this process. I don't know the answer to that. And y'all have gone into this a lot longer than I have, but that is the concern. You know, it's at what point do you bring in the details on utilities, on signage, on site lighting. Those sound like simple things, but when you add them all up, that's a lot of information early on that may or may never be used, because after public comment and board comments, board review, it may have to start over again. And I'm trying to figure out how we can better protect Southport by getting people to use this. One thing that's true to my heart, close to my heart, and that is tree protection. And a 5-acre site, which is minimum for this, has the same requirements as a 50-acre site, or vice versa. And if you've ever walked 50 acres of undeveloped land, finding specific trees and clusters of trees and landscape uniqueness is sometimes very difficult to put on. And again, I think it needs to be done, but I'm not sure how it can be done early on. And these are questions I have. I doubt that there's a developer who's ever walked 50 acres that it's going to be developed. And maybe that's what we need to concentrate on, making these people understand the piece of property they're getting ready to develop better. 150 acres. I doubt seriously that they've walked that 150 acres. But we're requiring it, and we are going to be hard-pressed to accept what we're seeing on that plan. But we're asking for it early on. And again, I'm asking these questions without answers, and this is what's frustrating me, because I don't have a good answer to these. I look at this and I go through. I mean, I can go in more detail, but those are the main concerns that I want this document to encourage someone who has gotten hold of a piece of land or has a piece of land and wants to develop it, and we can use this process to protect Southport, and at the same time don't discourage that person, because this is just an option. This is just an option. I mean, we're not requiring anybody to use this. We want people to use this. And I'm just not sure this yet is giving the encouragement we need, at the same time giving the protection that we all want for Southport. That's all I have to say. I wish I had all the answers, but these are my concerns and comments.
Any other discussion? Travis, did you want to comment on any of that for us?
Sure. Those are all very valid concerns with the draft as it's currently written. The same exact line of thinking is why I have advocated multiple times for keeping the flexibility in terms of dimensional standards in this draft. For the same thing, because Mr. Pender is absolutely correct that there are some of these standards that could make it cost prohibitive, effort prohibitive, what have you, from ever undertaking this process, and especially for bigger tracts. So, I mean, in terms of the minimum open space protection, that was drafted as a direct result of feedback received from the board. It doesn't have to stay in there. Even from the beginning, those standards were intended to just be minimums. And there's going to be some projects where it could be, you know, again, all of this being hypothetical, a 40-unit subdivision that still could reasonably preserve 50% of the site as open space. And then the inverse could also be true, where there's a 1,500-unit development that could only reasonably preserve 20%. But all of this being at the hypothetical early level, it's impossible to know until we see the project come in front of us. But the beauty of conditional zoning is that, unlike a by right project, the city holds effectively all of the cards. And we're the ones in charge of the review process. And even if we have a project that is in conformance with the land use plan and is a slam dunk with all of our long-range plans, if it's reasonable and in the public interest to deny the project, we have the ability to do that. The Board of Aldermen ultimately has the ability to do that. In terms of the landscaping and tree preservation section, we haven't talked much about the Appendix A changes through this whole process, but looks like it'd be page 41 of 51 in your packet under Appendix A, Section C, subsection 5, the landscaping and tree preservation. You know, this being straight out of the existing ordinance, yes, it requires, a conditional zoning application would require the location, species, and size of all regulated and specimen trees as defined by this ordinance. On a 5-acre site, as Mr. Pender mentioned, that's probably pretty easy to do. On a 50 or 150 or bigger parcel, that may not be possible to do at the early stage that this would be. There's a slide I have in here later which says, and I've said this a bunch of times, a conditional rezoning is not an approval to begin construction. There is, whatever the project may be, the major site plan process or the preliminary plat process comes after, which comes, either one of them will come back before this board, and at that point, the tree survey is required again. And so, ultimately, it would be up to the board, and ultimately the Board of Aldermen, since they are the ones in charge of approving the text amendment, to make any changes there. But in my opinion, backing off on that to be a more generalized tree survey, and maybe asking the applicant to generally speak to what efforts they are going to take to ensure protection of trees in a way that is in harmony with what we have come to expect and demand out of developers from the perspective of tree preservation, is perhaps the better route if the goal is, as Mr. Pender said, to encourage folks to undertake this process. I should have mentioned earlier, but Wes McLeod from the Council of Governments is also here, and not to put you on the spot, you may not have any feedback, but if he has any feedback on this topic, he is certainly welcome to take this microphone away from me. You don't have to.
Wes, you're welcome to come up. Always glad to have you. Thank you for being here.
Just about the feedback about the comments. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's up to the discretion of the board whether or not this tool even exists. It exists now in the city, but just sort of in a different fashion than is customary in a lot of other local governments, and for that reason, it hasn't necessarily been utilized. I think tweaking some of the submittal requirements is certainly something that you could do. I would caution about, taking away fully a tree survey, and perhaps having, more of the, I can't recall what the larger tree species, is it heritage here or specimen? Perhaps making sure that specimens are identified on the site, so, as that proposal comes before you guys can identify where some of the key areas are potentially for tree preservation. Open space, I would agree that if someone's faced with, off the top having to take away 30, 40, 50% of their buildable land, it will probably be very likely a non-starter, or potentially what will occur is that it will have to result in a proposal for a more dense housing type or housing product, multifamily or something to that effect, in order to get the yield that's necessary from that site. You know, they're gonna have to put 100 units together real tight in order to keep the open space. And that's certainly fine, but if it's, you know, something where you all are looking for a lower density residential product, whether it's 2 units, 3 units attached, or single families spread out, that would be really hard to do if you had to preserve, you know, that much land. But I'll leave it at that. I'll turn it back over to you all. Thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. And I'm available, I think, to speak to another item that's going to come up.
Other discussion about this or other parts included in your packet for CZ? Well, I'll say, Travis, again, well, let me approach this first. We talked about at our last meeting, we had some questions about what other cities are using this, and I'm going to get back to comments about this specifically in a minute, but we had those questions about who else is using it, and you had a list prepared for it. Do we have an idea of, I'm sorry, I'm making you skip ahead again, but let's look at that just a bit and see what correlation we can make to our efforts here.
So the first thing, and we're dovetailing, this dovetails very nicely. This is the same list that I showed last time. The only thing I will say is that, and don't tell them, but I forgot about Oak Island. And so, so Oak Island is on there now. But yeah, all of these local governments currently use conditional zoning. I focused on southeastern North Carolina with this list. Wasn't able to talk to all of them prior to sending this PowerPoint over to Cheyenne. So some of them I'm gonna have to tell you, and they're not on here. So a lot of some of these, Sunset Beach and St. James, both have only adopted it this year. Sunset Beach is currently working on their first one. It is an official submittal at this point. St. James doesn't have any officially applied for yet. However, according to their manager, they anticipate a meeting with a potential applicant any day now. The other ones that are worth highlighting here, Carolina Beach and Surf City. Surf City couldn't give me an exact number. Carolina Beach said they see at least 3 to 5 every year. Of course, all of these places have it set up a little bit differently. Surf City has said they've used it numerous times, including multiple pending right now. Burgaw has used it 4 times, potentially 2 more on the way, and they actively try to steer their applicants towards conditional zoning, especially when the applicant is going to need a rezoning either way in order to accomplish what their goals are for their property. Of course, Southport attempted once. It was, as far as I can tell, it was never officially withdrawn, but it was implicitly withdrawn. Also, Topsail Beach, skipped over. Topsail Beach, don't tell them that either. I forgot about them. They are working on one right now. It has been in the news quite a bit. It is for, if you're familiar with Topsail Beach at all, it is for the southern end of the island. It is a very large property that has been held in private ownership for a long time. However, it has been used by the public as if it was public land for a long time. So, obviously, as you know, they're trying to get a handle on what could possibly happen with that property. The applicant has chosen to go through the conditional zoning process as opposed to a by right rezoning process because of what could be allowed in those by right districts. Could be, 5,000 square foot lots, very dense residential development, and all the applicant wants to do is a compound for their family. Now, full disclosure, that compound is 8, 9 very large homes. 7 homes, okay. Off by 1. Yes, it's still a rather significant project, but the town of Topsail Beach understands that that's what it's going to be and will be able to, if they choose to approve it, which they're still working on it right now, if they choose to approve it, they're going to be able to lock that property into being just that, as opposed to just straight up rezoning the property, and then whatever is allowed by right by that zoning district could potentially be allowed at some point in the future. We are, as far as I can tell by my research, and I haven't gotten to every community, and you're not going to see any counties up here on this list, although every county in the region also uses this. We are the only ones, as far as I can tell, that made any distinction between whether you can ask for a conditional rezoning if you're zoned residential versus non-residential. The only communities that came close are Oak Island and Sunset Beach, which restricted residential but only on the island. Both Sunset Beach and Oak Island have obviously quite expansive mainland areas, and they allow for conditional rezonings from residential on the mainland, just not on the island. And you know what? As I was going through this list, I forgot Oak Island again. Oak Island, the response from the planner over at Oak Island was that they did not see, certainly not any conditional rezoning since that planner started with Oak Island, and very few in the past because of the restrictiveness of their ordinance. To Mr. Pender's point, the restrictions that they put in place on conditional rezonings made it a non-starter for a number of folks, and they chose a different route.
Were those restrictions similar to what we've been talking about here, the points that Roy has brought up, getting those guardrails tightened?
As far as I could tell, I didn't dive into it as much as I would have hoped in order to be able to speak more directly to that answer. Wes, you may know more about what they've got in their ordinance, but certainly similar restrictions to what Mr. Pender has mentioned, in addition to dimensional requirements, tying it to existing zoning districts, that sort of thing as well, which you'll see a number of. I mean, certainly not at all to suggest that Pender County and Southport have any similarities other than that, and they're in the same region of North Carolina. But when we made our changes to conditional zoning in 2020, it was because of the restrictiveness of conditional zoning as it had originally been written. It was not leading to the outcomes that we thought were best based on what the land use plan was calling for, and what it was trying to get done through the development process. So.
Who else? Comments?
I got one. When we're talking about this conditional rezoning, I noticed looking back, some people are talking about not expanding it in the residential sections. Am I correct? But that's not part of the whole deal. It's just one facet of it, not expanding it in the residential sections, because they're worried that I guess we'll get overpopulated, or who knows, we could have problems later on. Let's say if another hurricane hits or something like that, and the density. Am I correct?
Those things could certainly happen. I mean, this text amendment in front of you would allow for conditional rezonings to be applied for from the residential zoning districts. However, someone can propose a rezoning just a straight up rezoning from the residential districts now, that would accomplish the same thing.
Okay, and these guidelines we're setting in place now, there's no possibility of someone maybe coming back a little later and seeing something they don't like, if that's passed, and getting it changed.
In terms of, and are you referring to if a conditional rezoning is approved and then coming back and rescinding it? Or, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question.
No, it's probably a little difficult. What I'm thinking is, let's say we pass this amendment to it, and 10 years down the road, someone comes in and they don't like that, and they bring it back to the planning board and the alderman to have it rechanged again. Okay.
That is absolutely possible. It would be possible in a couple months. If we were being able to approve it tonight, yes, always.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry about that. I see that in day-to-day politics. 1 minute we're going one way, and then they switch it. That's all I have.
Yeah, I know we're looking on the points of clarification at things that are in Brunswick County, but I kind of expanded out a little beyond that, and there's a town I like to look at sometimes as an example to us, and that's Edenton. And the reason is, I mean, it was founded in 1722. It has roughly the same size, the same layout. It has a coastline similar to ours, but it's more recessed inward. They have a historic district that is just as in need of preservation as ours. And they adopted conditional zoning for the purpose of protecting that. And so far, from what I've been able to gather from that, they've been able to keep that whole, along with of course, their historic preservation committees and everything else that they have as well. So they've been able to use that to buffer, if you will, and to protect that historic area from basically being overrun. So it's I know, well, you worked with Edenton some, but you didn't work on that. But I think you can attest to. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Wes, but I think you can attest that it's a really nice town. I mean, if you've never been there, I suggest you go, because a lot of their downtown area and a lot of their surrounding area is what we want to have here as well. They like to mirror us, and we'd like to mirror them, I would say. And I encourage anybody to go, and you'll understand how conditional zoning can protect those. Can protect that type of area, because we are unique here, but they're very unique up there as well, and it's and that's something that we can kind of use as an example. I would encourage both this board and our board of aldermen to look at that in regards to that. Because it does give a good template, because they've already done it, and so far it seems to be working well, from what I understand. If I'm wrong with that, please let me know.
So what do our members hear in Roy's comments and the information that we were given originally, and then as we've proposed changes to it, has anything that has been opined on here tonight, does that change anything about members' thoughts on those two items that were put in recently as far as the open space thresholds and the maximum height. I agree that we don't want to make this so prohibitive with so many restrictions that folks walk from using it. That's not the point. Be no point in having it at all if it was such that they turned and ran just as soon as they saw what they were getting into. I appreciate Roy saying we want to be able to encourage folks, and I'm seeing that in these comments that other towns use it quite often to encourage them, developers, to go that route, and we certainly don't want to get it to the point to where nobody wants to do this. That would appear to be a waste all the way around. So what are members' thoughts on those two areas where Roy's brought up these comments? Do we want to change those? Do we want to omit those? What do we want to leave them the very same? What do we want to do?
I think it would be good to relax the open space requirements, minimums. We can always raise the bar during the review process, but if it's too high, nobody's going to want to use it. I know that Indigo would be good to go through this process if they would submit to it. If it's too stringent, that's not going to work. They're not going to want to do it. So I think if we relax that a little bit, knowing we can raise the bar as far as the expense of the tree survey up front in the process, that sequence, would we need to change that tonight before we vote, or can that be done later?
Well, given that Appendix A is also part of this text amendment, if there was a motion to recommend approval, it could be recommend approval on essentially with the condition that that section be revised prior to its presentation to the Board of Aldermen. It would not be that difficult of a change, and it doesn't change anything from the perspective of what hoops they have to jump through before they can start construction. It just changes when. But it's all still prior to construction.
And you're talking about revision of the tree protection preservation part of Appendix A.
Essentially following what is listed in other places, which is, some approximation being allowed. And I very much appreciate what Wes mentioned about keeping specimen trees, as you are going to have to go find those. But regulated trees, as we've seen with a project that shall remain nameless over near Stewart and Fodale, some of these tracts can have a large number of trees on them. And at this preliminary stage, at the conditional rezoning, it may not be appropriate to go identify all of them, especially if they're going to get denied. So.
Other members' comments?
I have one more question on Carolina Beach and Surf City. Were any of those residential?
They don't distinguish. That they just, conditional zoning is a conditional rezoning is just something that any property owner can ask for.
Carolina Beach is mostly residential, same as Surf City.
For the purposes of the microphone, Carolina Beach and Surf City are mostly residential rezonings, conditional rezonings.
I have one. I'm not very in favor to loosen the tree ordinance, because when you're driving around town now and you're headed towards 211 or 87, you can see a long ways, and I lived out west, and I'd hate for this to turn into another Kansas. I mean, I don't think it'll get like that, but those trees serve a good and important purpose, especially when we're on the water.
Yes, and again, just to be clear, this doesn't at all change the requirements of the tree ordinance. It would just change the when of when they're enforced.
I can attest to the development, which we shall not mention, that and about the tree preservation, that no matter what we say about removal of trees, the Board of Aldermen is not going to let that happen. I can attest to that right now because I know that there are some, I should say, champions of trees that serve on that board because that's what the public wants. And to this, and I've stressed this throughout the entire time, that this is something that not only is the planning board, the Board of Aldermen and staff, but this is something that directly involves the public as well and their input, and it has to be addressed. On tree protection, yeah, I don't see lessening that at all. But I mean, as far as but on open space, I can understand where that would be, where there could be some relaxing of that to encourage this to go forward. And ultimately, as we've said, it's up to the Board of Aldermen to do this. We're providing a template, and I think we've provided about as good a template as we can give them so that they could start their work. I can't think of anything else that we can do except give our strongest recommendation that these, all these issues that we brought up be looked at and voted on. Of course, they're also at the will of their constituency, that they're going to receive that input individually from everyone that they serve, and ultimately they're going to make a decision, and it would be I think it would benefit the town to get a different perspective on this and give it to them. And if they have questions, they could always send that back to us if need be, but or they could always deny parts or change parts. There's nothing that says that this is not a commandment brought down from the mount, on a stone tablet. This is a living document. I think we breathed about as much life into it as we can. So, if anybody has anything else, I think we've, I think.
So what I'm hearing now from members is that the open space guardrail that was put in, these limitations or this restrictions for open space, this is something that you would like to see omitted from this as a way of trying to encourage it? Revise it to what?
So rather than the ceiling being at 50%, what if we had the ceiling at 35%? Use the same metrics to get there, but then instead of 50%, it's capped at 35%. And I think to Roy's point, I think he's right. I think larger pieces of land, in order to be financially viable, folks are going to start condensing, which is kind of against a little bit of what we're trying to do here.
We already have a minimum on open space anyway. So we could, there would automatically be a minimum on open space anyway, especially on, that we could leave it as a PUD minimum of 20% would be, you know, the absolute minimum open space. But to encourage that, I mean, I'm with Chris on this too, that we could lessen the maximum out. We could start it at 20 and just go to say 35.
Well,
Was that
yes,
what you were talking about, Chris? Yeah. Okay.
if that's the consensus, then either it rises by 2.5% every 250 units, or the same threshold is in place and it just stops counting at 35 instead of going to 50. There's two different ways to, so.
And in the review process, the bar can always be raised.
Any conversation on the max height? I circled that as another thing that was most recently discussed. Any changes proposed for that? I'm not suggesting any since it's outlined already for the different zoning districts. I don't see that being an issue. Anyone else? I would note that this proposal, this text amendment, is a process ordinance that we're working on here. It's not a guarantee of anything that any developer wants they're going to get out of that. It's a way for the public to be involved in all of this from the very beginning, which has always been important for all of us, insistent that we keep the public engaged and involved in anything, and a way for the city to, and I've said this before, I know a lot of folks don't like the word negotiate with developers, but I would point out this is a way to make it a win-win, basically, for the developers and the city. And to that point of not wanting to negotiate, you know, everyone was so upset, I'll refer back to it, when Indigo ended its pursuit this most previous time, and a lot of folks were upset that there was talk that the city was negotiating with Indigo, and everybody got so upset about the thought that the city was talking with folks or negotiating, but yet at last week's alderman's meeting regarding Oakton, that's what everybody wanted done, negotiate with the developer. So this makes a way for that to take place from the very beginning, with the city having the reins on it, to get something good, hopefully, every time for our city. So I think it's a profitable thing. I think it's a viable thing for us to have. I would say at this point, I'd like to see us go ahead and act on a motion to approve the zoning text amendment that's before us with these revisions that we've made tonight, and looking at that, making those changes to Appendix A for the tree preservation part before it goes to the Board of Aldermen. Any other comments anyone would make? Or Chris?
So Travis did ask one question about our ceiling issue. Do you want it to climb up 2.5%? It's up to 1,500, or stop it? I guess the math would be 750. My recommendation would be to keep climbing 5%, like it has been, but then just stop at 30. What did we say, 35%?
35.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Travis?
I have a question. Why are we penalizing large developments?
what makes it penalizing?
I can come in with 25-acre developments and do everything at 20%. Or I can come in at 100 and have to go to 35%. I just am saying again, if we're going to encourage people to use this, we should not be penalizing them for pulling properties together that will give the city a better opportunity to negotiate with a larger piece of property. And I believe this 20%, I'd like to know what industry standards are. I mean, I really, are we pulling these figures out of the air? Or is these standards that other cities have gotten and found out that they work great? Again, I don't believe in starting from scratch. I always believe in finding out what's been done and successful. And I'm giving personal concerns, and I want to maximize the opportunity to developers to want to use this. And we have the ability then to negotiate, to work with the developers, to see what they're planning, see what tree masses they're dealing with, see what the natural areas are, and see what they're trying to do. But just because they've got a larger piece of property, I just feel like that's penalizing someone who's coming in with a large piece of land. 5 acres? I think I can't answer what a developer would do, but I mean 15% more open space. If I come in with a bigger piece of property, I'd have to think twice about it.
So the open space, to my understanding, is not tied to land size. It's tied to density.
That's correct.
Right.
And the number of units.
So I think when folks are coming in with larger pieces of land, my hope is that, and again, I'm all for dimensional standards, and I'm all for having some sort of underlying standards that bubble up rather than just leaving it all open, but that's another conversation. And I think my hope is that people would keep more open space. And I see what you're saying. I don't see as much of a correlation between like this being a discouraging tool. The number 20% we came up with when the UDO was rewritten back in early 2020, I think at one point was 10% when the previous UDO, or 15%. And then when we were having conversations, the 20% was just a number. And I think to your point, Roy, I don't know where they came from. And I know it was all over Zoom, but 20% was a number that was landed on. And I guess I advocate for more. I think there should be more open space inside of parcels. And my hope is that, again, if we had an R20 district, that conditional rezoning would have some standards underneath it that would keep it that similar density. And so, but obviously this conditional zoning piece doesn't have that. So I guess to your point, I don't know if it really matters about the numbers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, the 20% was increased as part of the UDO, but I would say that it ranges. How folks calculate their open space varies throughout the region, but anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20% is pretty standard. I will say that from the standpoint of designing a site, it's much easier, or it makes typically more sense and sometimes better for a jurisdiction is you have a standard framework that says you off the top have to have 20% open space, period. If it is based upon the number of units, then you have an iterative process. In other words, trying to sort out how much open space is based upon when you're moving your units around can be a difficult thing to work through and oftentimes discouraging. You guys always have the ability to, increase it to 25%, 35%, whatever it may be in the future. I think it may be interesting to know if this gets used at all, if you set it as 20%, and then certainly throughout the process to say, hey, look, you've got this other area over here, we would like you to consider conserving that as well. That would just be my take on it. 35% is certainly a whole lot, especially if you cannot take into account wetlands, things of that nature.
Madam Chair, is there some way to tie open space to the preservation of specimen trees and tree clusters? That is what we all want. We want to protect the trees, and we get back to identifying the specimen trees that we want to save, and somehow can we tie the location of the open spaces to coincide with the best trees? That's what we want, isn't it? So is there some way to do that and get the best of both worlds?
So the tree preservation that we have now has a bit of you get a credit for saving specific trees. And can we do something maybe similar to that, where if they save tree A, B, and C, then your threshold isn't 30, it's 29, or you lose a percentage point or something based on open space? Does that maybe answer that question, or a solution or an idea, an option?
Options.
Yeah.
I just all of a sudden realized it may not be the quantity of open space as it is the quality of open space, which is addressed in here to a point. But if we can tie the preservation of trees to the location of the open space, I'd rather have 20% of treed open space than 35% of bulldozed whatever. Again, I'm searching for answers, and again, I'm sort of coming in the back door here, and I hate that I'm causing any frustrations, but I'm seeing that we're very close here.
Well, I don't think you're causing frustration at all. I think the discussion is great. I think as Travis said a while ago, the beauty of conditional zoning is that staff can have input, staff can have those discussions with developers to say, okay, we've identified this portion of the tract as having a plethora of specimen trees that, guess what, you're going to preserve, okay? Here's your map, work around it. And I think that's, one of the other things, again, referring back to previous times and nothing against any prior staff, but this board got we had to do the review for Indigo, okay? Our subcommittees were shackled in and we did that review, okay? And it was hard work. There was a lot that went into it. There was a lot of considerations that we were kind of chastised for going in too deep into things, but it gave those developers something to think about. I have always said it let those developers know that Southport was not a city that you could just come in and run over with your glossy brochures and wonderful presentations to everybody and big smiles. So out of that, I think we all learned a lot about what we had to do in all of that and the things that we had to identify. But I will sit here and say, with the staff that we have in place now, we would have never reviewed the first line of anything that was in that Indigo submission. And I think when I say staff would see, I think, to these open space requirements or changes that could be made to all of that, that's their expertise. I mean, and I'm grateful that we have these folks now that have this education, have this experience already. And certainly we're all going to still stay involved in it. But I think we can see that staff would be the one at the front of the train driving this and identifying those areas. I will gratefully trust staff to run that part of it, so that we're not having to do that. But I think that, again, that's part of the beauty of staff saying, we'll take it from here. We can get this done for the city. That's kind of their job, bottom line, I think, to it for me.
I've had my say. Thank you.
Well,
When we did that review, I was on the traffic study, but I was also on the environmental study. And one of the things that was a concern about open space that I brought up to them, and they didn't realize it until then, now at that point we had a minimum of 20%. But they were allotting somewhere around 24.5%, 25%. But it gave them the option to move parts of that and allow greenway thoroughfares, treed areas for wildlife to move through. And what it did was it took some of that density. There was a lot of density, but it took some of that density and spread it apart enough to give those natural greenways for stuff to move through. So my thinking is that if we would have had something like this as such a large development, they were having that density in smaller areas, but it allowed us enough space because of the size to open up those greenways and form those paths through those areas back into the marshlands or back over to where Duke Energy's land is, or even back to the city. It opened those up by having a higher amount of green space. We were able to separate those just by adding a little pavement here and taking some away over here and doing it that way. So that's where that negotiating tool comes in. And it allowed us some leeway before everything just stopped, but it allowed us some leeway to have also as well something that's very beneficial to us all, which is those natural breaks which keep those winds aloft, so that we don't have the destruction that we have in a highly dense area with nothing. So that's one of the things that we did on that. Now, Mo was on that board. She headed that board up. She's not here, but I was on that board as well, and that's something that we brought up about having those greenways. So by having a little extra space, when we know we're going to have a large area, it gives us an option to negotiate movement around it, so that we can have smaller neighborhoods, if you will, with some buffer in between. So that's one reason I think we need a little bit more green space available. I hope
Any other comments, discussion? Okay, did you want to say something, Travis?
just, I don't know if, and maybe I'm the only one in the room who didn't hear consensus about the open space requirement. Okay, I'll be quiet.
No, please. So what I heard was that we wanted to lessen the maximum to 35%, leave it in with that maximum, so that we're keeping those that guideline there? Yes? Okay, so then we'll go back to what I was asking for. With that change there and the review and changes to Appendix A for the tree preservation, leaving the specimen trees in, yes, sir?
Just to be clear, the only change there would be essentially under section C5B, removing regulated but keeping specimen.
Are the members in agreement with that? That's on page 41 of your packets. 5B on that page. So item B would start with specimen trees, is that right? I'm sorry, it would take out location, species, and size of specimen trees, is that correct? Members in agreement?
Are you saying delete that?
No, just take out regulated. So it would read, Travis, am I doing this right?
Yes, you are.
Location, species, and size of all specimen trees as defined by this ordinance.
And then section C below that would still require them to identify all groves of trees to be protected. And they would still be required to identify all of the protected trees within those groves.
So no changes to C. It
Right, I'm saying C helps
takes care of
capture
that.
back some of what you lose by B.
Go ahead.
So when Osprey Landing went in and they submitted their tree survey, it was 66 acres-ish, and they had done a survey for a majority of the property and then just said, this is what 35% of it looks like, and we're assuming the rest of the property looks to be the same. So they didn't do a survey on the entire property. But they did, if I remember right, they did mark specimen throughout the property, but they didn't do all the regulated. Could we just, I don't know, I'm indifferent, I don't know. How does that, I guess, process work? I mean, that was a while ago, but.
Well, it was under the old UDO, and so I'm not sure that tool, and I don't have the full ordinance in front of me, I don't know that tool exists anymore that would allow someone to generalize, you know, take a snapshot of the property and generalize it to the whole thing. I tend to agree with Mr. Pender that requiring the full tree survey, which again, they're going to have to do anyway, regardless, but requiring it if they're just asking for a conditional rezoning, when they are then going to have to come back in front of this board, back in front of the alderman, with the full tree survey that demonstrates not only that they're in compliance with the ordinance, but also that they're in compliance with any additional conditions that the planning board and the alderman put upon them. To me, I think it's reasonable to lessen the requirements here. And I think just removing the word regulated is probably a good start. There's going to be some projects that come in front of this board where in the course of the discussion, the direction's going to be, you know what, you need to go do the full tree survey. Especially on smaller tracks, that's going to be necessary sometimes, and you have the ability to do that.
I also think we should move the regulated part. My question was more of a clarification, curiosity. That's all. Plus one.
So we're good with that discussion on 5C? Okay. Back to. Do I hear a motion to approve this zoning text amendment with the change for the lessening of the open space requirements for a maximum of 35%, and the revisions as appropriate to Appendix A regarding tree preservation, for forwarding this on to the Board of Aldermen for its consideration and ultimate decision.
So moved.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Fred. Now, as part of that, we do need that consistency statement read. 33. Page 33, that is correct. Yep. Thank you, Will.
The City of Southport Planning and Zoning Board finds that the proposed zoning text amendment is consistent with the 2014 Camelcore Land Use Plan adopted November 13th, 2014, and subsequently amended by the Board of Aldermen specifically for the purposed zoning text amendment is consistent with the plan due to its allowance for the development patterns that are explicitly identified as desirable by the plan but are not currently possible under the Unified Development Ordinance. The inclusion of the public within the development process and the explicit requirement that all conditional rezonings be evaluated for their conformance to the 2014 Camelcore Land Use Plan and any other adopted plans relevant to the proposal. Further, conditional zoning allows the board greater flexibility in promoting economic efficiency, optimizing resources, and preserving wetlands, wildlife habitat, and other environmentally sensitive areas.
Thank you, Will. A motion has been made. It's on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Aye. All opposed? No. Motion passes with one dissenting vote. And do we still have Scott? We lost him, okay. We'll get the number of approval votes so that we can include those in the minutes along with that one dissenting vote. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a great discussion. I appreciate that. We don't have any new business on our agenda, so we'll move to other business. Travis has asked to introduce discussion of items in our tree ordinance, which is section 3.18, page 3-80 of the UDO. Travis?
All right. This is going to be the briefest of brief discussions, and I understand how ironic it is that I am the one who am saying that. So, first off, why talk about this? Staff, myself, and Mo have been a lot more involved in the tree permit review process over the past month or so due to some staffing changes that have occurred within the Development Services Department with regard to code enforcement. Our code enforcement officer was the one who was handling most tree permits. Of course, Mo and myself were reviewing tree permits in the context of new construction. There's been some lessons that we've learned, lessons that we've learned but haven't been able to do anything about yet, and just wanted to bring this to the planning board's attention and let you all know some of the things we're thinking about. We're also attempting to be proactive here, trying to catch some unintended consequences within the UDO that have not caused any significant issues yet, but could be used against the city, in the future. The first example of this is the critical root zone, and this is just one, I just called out a couple examples. This is not everything, but just want to kind of paint a picture here. Critical root zone protections for trees. The critical root zone of a tree is defined in the definitions section as 1.5 feet per inch of diameter at breast height. So, for example, if you have a 30-inch diameter tree, your critical root zone is a 45-foot radius extending from the base of the tree in every direction. And the restrictions about what you can and cannot do in the critical root zone are rather strict. You are not allowed to cut down into the ground more than 3 inches. You're not allowed to add more than 3 inches of fill. You are not allowed to place any impervious surface within the critical root zone. There's a whole bunch of restrictions about what you can do in the critical root zone during construction. And there is also a section that talks about how roots should be cut when you're working in and around trees, but also it says that those roots can not be cut within the critical root zone. It can only be done outside of the protective fence, which is supposed to be on the outside of the critical root zone. And there's a whole lot of other sections that seem to contradict each other. And then when you add in the incentives for protecting live oaks that we have talked about earlier, you combine that with the restrictiveness of the critical root zone and no mention of any authority for staff to work with applicants to come up with the best reasonable solution. And what you've ended up with is actually an incentive to remove the tree as opposed to working with it on the site. I understand why the critical root zone protections are there. They are industry standard. They're not, it's not a number that Southport pulled out of a hat and just put in the ordinance. However, there's a number of examples that I think we can think of, or that we could go see just by driving down House Street or just by looking out the window, and see where there's definitely been impacts inside the critical root zone, and those trees still appear to be healthy, and those are probably in the least hospitable environment in Southport. The trees right in front of City Hall, the new City Hall, are right up against the road. I mean, look at East-West Street. Look at the parking lot of the smokehouse and all of those live oaks that are in and around the parking lot. I think those a lot of what we think of as, you know, development that has grown up with the trees and what makes Southport so cool to hang out in with all of these live oaks that are very in and around buildings. Your current ordinance makes it almost impossible, if you read it as strict as it reads, to do anything. And that's probably not what was intended to have happen. However, and I'm not saying that, you know, I don't want to say anything about what was done in the past. However, if it's in the ordinance, it should be enforced as the ordinance reads. And if the ordinance is intended to grant flexibility to folks to work with individual projects to realize the goals of the city, then I'm gonna need the ordinance to give me the authority to do that. Otherwise, my direction to an applicant, Mo's direction to an applicant, is going to be to tell the applicant to apply for a variance. And that's not easy to get, especially not in Southport with a Board of Adjustment that is as by the book as what we have. So this has come up multiple times just in the past week, where we have you know, a tree on a property that has a relatively large critical root zone. By the way, I'm not even getting to the argument that this critical root zone stuff could be considered a taking if you enforce it as strictly as it reads, but someone could probably make the argument. Whether they win or not, I don't know. But what we've got is a scenario where the applicant for just a single home site, it's just a single family home, has a number of live oaks on the property. And so they are not required to mitigate at all because they're preserving 80 plus inches worth of live oaks. It's a relatively large single family property. It's over in the landing. However, there is a live oak in the front that they were hoping to incorporate as part of the front of the, front of the streetscape of the home. However, the driveway gets relatively close to it. And when asked about, okay, well, what is your intention to protect the critical root zone based on this section of the tree ordinance? The response was, well, I can't do that. There's no possible way to do that. And I know that I'm protecting a bunch of live oaks, so why don't I just take the tree down? Well, that's not what we wanted to have happen, now was it? And so they haven't taken the tree down yet, don't worry, and they're not planning on it. But getting the ability for us to work with folks to try to avoid those kind of situations where we end up in a catch-22 is very important. The other thing, and I said this would be brief, and I'm already not following through on that, the length and layout of the article itself. The tree ordinance, I think, could probably say the exact same thing it does now in about half the pages. It's very complex. As you read through it, it kind of wraps around itself and starts talking about one thing and then goes on to a different thing and then comes back to itself. There's sections where it repeats itself. There's sections where it's not that the standards themselves are not the problem. It's just difficult to understand. And in a case like this where, our tree permits cost nothing, because we want to remove any disincentive possible from complying with this section. I mean, if there's, I don't know about y'all, but I think if there's maybe one section of Article 3 we would apply, it would probably be this one in Southport. And we want folks to be able to read the ordinance and clearly understand, okay, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, and this is what I need to ask permission to do. Removing any disincentive if possible from complying with what we have. So I say all this to say our next big item, the next big piece that Mo and I want to be proactive about is this. I don't have a draft yet. I haven't even started on a draft. However, any feedback you have now, we would be absolutely welcome anything you've got right now, anything you've got in the future. This is going to take some time. If there's one thing I've learned about Southport, it's that you're never going to not be busy. And so it's going to take some time. It's probably going to be a couple months before it's back in front of you. However, any feedback you have now, any feedback you have in the future, we would greatly appreciate it, so that way when we bring it before you, it's something close to complete.
Any comments for Travis now?
You weren't here whenever I brought this up some time ago, and we went through a course of change of losing a planner and having an interim and whatnot. But there is a product out there, and I brought this up at one time, but it was late. It was late in the ordinance, and anyway, some people call it track matting, but it's actually called ground protective coverings. Now there's several different kinds of those, but what it does is that when you are bringing in equipment, the actual matting itself goes around the critical root zones, and in most cases can support anywhere from 40 to 80,000 pounds and disperse that so that it does not damage the ground underneath. Literally, you could take it out there and right out front here in front of the museum, lay it down and drive an 80,000 pound excavator over it, pull it up, and you never even know that it went over it. And that's something that could be added to that with the fencing around the area, because it doesn't take much to back over that fencing and then you've killed it. Whereas if they added the protective matting, it allows, there are several different kinds. There's a solid matting, but then there's also an open link matting, and that open link matting can also be used for the purpose of, first of all, getting water and nutrients to that tree which you set to protect, but also you can use it as part of the paving process so that when that pavement is settling, it doesn't bend down and actually kill that tree as well. So that's there are quite a few companies that use those, that come in as part of their tree service as far as protecting those things. But those, I mean, there's companies that just rent that stuff out. And the good thing about that matting is that as it gets destroyed, as it gets rolled over, they collect it. In most cases, they collect it, they take it, they recycle it, and they make matting out of it again. So it's not something that's going to be left behind to be an environmental hazard as well. It's something that these companies collect it up, no matter if it's split, cracked, or chipped, they take it with them. And actually, and then when they leave, it's so they've never even been there before. So, and most of the time, the sheeting ranges from either 2 feet wide all the way up to about 4 feet wide, and they layer it in. But like I said, they can drive anything they want to over the top of it, and it won't hurt. It may cause 2 inches of actual indentation into the soil, so it cuts down on the erosion and also the actual damage. So that's something that I could get with you on that, and we could look into it, but that it is a proven process that does protect those trees, especially. And no matter it could be if a property owner's working, that they're going to have to lay those mats down. Even if that root system's coming over, they're going to have to protect that other tree as well, just by simply laying that matting down. That prevents any accidental tree homicide, I guess you want to call it.
Would it be appropriate to volunteer if they need input? I mean, I'd love to volunteer, God forbid. But this is close and dear to my heart.
Knowing your background, yes, you were absolutely. Yes.
As needed, I will volunteer.
You would have been volunteered eventually anyway.
Off.
It's coming your way.
Any other comments? And certainly volunteering or anything that we want to get with Travis about regarding this Travis Rameau about this, absolutely. We need to be involved in this, helping out with this as this goes, most certainly. Thank you, Travis, for that. This has been a great meeting, y'all. From the discussion that's been held, from the things that we've gotten accomplished, I'll say, and for me to recognize that we are continuing to look at our UDO, the things that we need to do to it to further protect the city, what we know is the right thing to do for our city. We're well on the way to make improvements to this, so I'm really pleased with all of this tonight. Thank y'all all so much. All of our agenda items are complete. I'll ask if there's any additional other business to be brought before our body tonight.
Can I ask a question, rather? So since Scott wasn't here to vote for the conditional zoning part, can my vote be heard on that or be noted?
Yes.
Okay. Do we need to do any process, or can I just blurt out?
We'll make note of it. That's why I'd ask if he had dropped off to be able to get you included in that, Chris. So how would you like that recorded?
I'm also a no on it, Renee.
Okay.
That's what I was wondering, that bit.
in to vote. I mean, because we lost Scott, but he was here for a little while. So
Okay,
now he's out, so you would have to be voted in.
okay. So let's get this right, because we don't want to get in trouble about this later on. All right, so do I hear a motion for in Scott Jones' absence as an ETJ member? Do I hear a motion that Chris Jones be put in as a voting member for tonight's meeting?
So moved.
Thank you, and a second? All right, motion on the floor. Any further discussion? Everyone in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Jones, how would you like your vote recorded on conditional zoning?
I'm a nay, or a no.
So recorded. Thank you so much. And now at this point, do I hear a motion that we take Chris Jones out of, as a voting member? And a second?
Second.
Thank you, Fred. Motion's on the floor. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Thank you so much. Motion carries unanimously. Is there any other additional business? I will indicate to you in your member information in your packets that staff has updated their roster based on the changes recently made for all city boards and commissions, showing the term expirations consistent with all those boards and commissions. Any questions for staff regarding those changes on the roster? I will ask, Tanya, have we heard anything back from the county on Chris's reappointment as that ETJ alternate?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for staff. Is there any way to forward emails from the city email addresses, my own, to my personal email? It's there? I looked around, I didn't see it. So is that a yes?
Possibly. That is going to be a Eileen, our IT contractor question. I feel like the answer should be yes, but we would have to ask our actual IT person, because she's the one who handles all of the city emails. So if you shoot her an email from your planning board email and let her know, she should be able to get you set up with that.
Okay, and you'll find as usual the attendance chart is included in your packets. Anyone have any announcements?
For Chris, there's a new Dave Matthews Band record coming out tomorrow, just so you know.
And now, with no other business, can I get a motion to adjourn, please? Look at this. This is a lot going on now. Okay. Motion is on the floor. Any final discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you so much, everyone. Our meeting is adjourned at 7:56.
Google and found the instructions on how to forward out. Do you want me to send it to you? What's your email? I mean, give me your phone number. I'll just text it.